The night air, usually a cool balm against the remembered heat of the Dakota sun, was choked with an acrid bitterness, a malevolent entity that clawed at Elara's throat and burned her eyes. Sleep had been a restless, shallow thing, haunted by the lingering scent of wood smoke from a distant grass fire days earlier. But this was different. This was immediate. This was consuming. She awoke not to the gentle pre-dawn grays she knew, but to an infernal orange glow that pulsed against her eyelids. A demonic heartbeat thrumming through the thin walls of the small cabin she and Thomas had built with their own hands, timber by timber, hope by hope. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through the last vestiges of sleep, and she sat bolt upright, the rough-spun blanket falling away. The crackle was no longer a distant whisper. It was a hungry roar, the sound of a beast devouring its prey, and the prey was her home, her sanctuary, her world. The air in the small room was already thick, shimmering with heat, and the smell of burning pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet that might have been her mother's linen, filled her nostrils. Panic, raw and primal, threatened to paralyze her, but the image of Thomas's face, his laughing eyes, the memory of his calloused hand in hers, somehow cut through the fear. He would have known what to do. He would have been calm. But Thomas was gone, taken by the fever 2 winters past, leaving her adrift in a sea of memories and the harsh realities of a solitary life. Now, even those memories were being consumed. She scrambled from the bed, her bare feet hitting the cool floorboards, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat building around her. Smoke billowed under the door to the main room, thick and oily. She coughed, a racking, painful sound. The window. She had to get to the window. It was small, and Thomas had always meant to make it larger, but now its very smallness seemed a cruel joke. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers slick with a sudden, terrified sweat. The wood was hot to the touch. Outside, the world was a canvas of leaping flames and swirling, angry cinders, painting the familiar landscape of her small homestead in terrifying, demonic hues. The barn, her milk cow Bess, the chickens Thomas had so carefully fenced in, thoughts flashed like sparks in her mind, each one a fresh stab of pain. The main room was an inferno, the roar was deafening. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the front door was no longer an option. The window sash creaked, protested, then finally gave way. Smoke, thick as a woolen shroud, poured in from outside as well, carried on the wind that was now fanning the flames into a frenzy. She coughed again, her lungs screaming. It was like trying to breathe fire. She could feel the intense heat on her face, her hair. Despair began to whisper, a seductive, terrible invitation to simply give in, to let the flames take her as they were taking everything else. Then, through the swirling chaos of smoke and embers, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the raging fire like some apparition from a fever dream. A man on horseback, materializing out of the heart of the disaster. He was tall in the saddle, his form indistinct in the hellish light, but there was a sense of purpose, of grim determination in the way he dismounted, the way he moved towards the burning cabin, his face obscured by shadow and the brim of his hat. He shouted something, but his words were devoured by the fire's insatiable hunger. Elara could only stare, frozen between terror and a disbelieving flicker of hope. He was at the window now, his shoulder hitting the frame, then again with more force. The wood splintered. He reached in, his hands surprisingly steady, and she felt a strong grip on her arm. "Come on!" His voice was rough, strained, but it cut through the roar, a lifeline in the maelstrom. "You have to jump. Jump?" The ground seemed impossibly far, the landing uncertain, but the alternative was a fiery tomb. The heat was scorching her skin, the smoke stealing her breath. She nodded, a jerky, desperate movement. His hands were under her arms, strong, impersonal, hauling her through the opening as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, she was suspended between the inferno and the unknown, then she was falling, scraping against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall, landing hard on the packed earth. The breath knocked from her lungs. Cold air, or what felt like cold air after the furnace of the cabin, rushed into her gasping lungs, bringing with it the full, horrifying symphony of destruction. He was beside her instantly, helping her to her feet, his arm a steadying brace around her waist. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice still gruff, but with an undertone of urgency that brooked no argument. She could only nod, her gaze fixed on the cabin. The roof was collapsing inwards, sending a geyser of sparks and flame high into the night sky, a funeral pyre for her life, her memories, her love. A sound escaped her then, a low, guttural keen of pure agony, torn from the very depths of her soul. It was the sound of everything breaking. The man didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply turned her away from the sight, his grip firm, guiding her towards his horse, which stood patiently, its eyes wide and reflecting the terrible light, but otherwise calm amidst the chaos. He lifted her onto the saddle as if she were a child, then swung up behind her, his presence a solid, unfamiliar wall at her back. The heat was still intense, even as they moved away, the roar of the fire pursuing them like a vengeful spirit. She leaned back against him, not out of any conscious desire for comfort, but out of sheer, boneless exhaustion and a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. She was vaguely aware of the horse's powerful movement beneath them, the creak of leather, the man's steady breathing behind her, but it all seemed distant, unreal. The world had narrowed to the taste of ash in her mouth, the sight of her life being erased, and the suffocating blanket of grief. She didn't know who this man was, or where he had come from, or why he had appeared in the heart of her desolation. She only knew that he had pulled her from the flames, a silent, grim-faced savior who smelled of dust, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the open range, a stark contrast to the charnel house her home had become. As they rode further into the darkness, away from the monstrous glow, a single, cold star glinted in the smoke-haze sky, a tiny, indifferent pinprick of light in an overwhelming darkness. Elara closed her eyes, the tears finally coming, hot and silent, tracing paths through the soot on her cheeks, each one a testament to what had been lost, and the terrifying, empty void of what was to come. The man behind her remained silent, a steady, unreadable presence, his arms loosely around her only to ensure she did not fall, the silence between them as vast and desolate as the landscape that was now illuminated by the distant, fading beacon of her ruin. She was alive, yes, but in that moment, adrift in a sea of shock and unspeakable loss, life felt like a cruel, unbearable burden, a smoldering ember rescued from a conflagration, uncertain if it had the strength or the will to ever glow again. The subtle tension of his unknown identity, his stoic silence, and the sheer precipice of her new reality hung heavy in the air, a silent question mark at the end of a devastating chapter. The dawn arrived not with its customary gentle blush across the prairie, but as a pale, reluctant smear of gray seen through the grimy pane of a small window in a room that was not her own. Elara lay on a narrow cot, a coarse blanket pulled up to her chin, though the chill she felt was bone deep, impervious to any warmth. The smell of unfamiliarity was sharp in her nostrils. Stale dust, old wood, the faint, lingering scent of someone else's life. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The events of the night, a nightmarish jumble of heat, smoke, and a faceless rescuer. Then memory, cold and brutal, flooded back, and the weight of it pressed down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Her home, Thomas's legacy, their shared dreams, all ash. A dry sob escaped her, a ragged, painful sound in the quiet room. She pushed herself up, her body aching from the fall, her muscles stiff and protesting. Her simple nightgown was torn and grimy, her hair matted with soot and debris. She felt like a wraith, a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's existence. The room was sparse. The cot, a rickety washstand with a chipped porcelain basin and ewer, a single wooden chair. Through the window, she could see the flat, unforgiving expanse of the plains, stretching out to a horizon that seemed to promise nothing but more emptiness. She had no idea how far they had ridden or to whose doorstep her silent rescuer had brought her. The door creaked open, and the man from the fire stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway. In the dim morning light, she could see him more clearly. His face was weathered, lean, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of harsh sun and harder miles. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were direct, assessing, holding no discernible pity, only a kind of quiet observation. He wore a worn denim shirt, dusty trousers, and scuffed boots. He was, she supposed, a cowboy, one of the solitary men who drifted across the vastness of the territory, their pasts as much a mystery as their destinations. He carried a tin cup of what smelled like coffee and a piece of dry bread on a tin plate. "Figured you might be awake," he said, his voice still low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. He didn't enter further, just held out the meager offering. She took it, her hand trembling slightly. Their fingers brushed, his calloused and warm, a fleeting impersonal contact. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. Where am I?" He gestured vaguely with his chin. "McTavish place. They're good folk. Away for a few days, visiting kin. Said I could use the line shack if I needed." A line shack. So, he was a drifter, perhaps working a temporary stint for the McTavishes. And he had brought her here, to this isolated outpost. The fire," she began, the words catching in her throat. His expression didn't change, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Spread fast, wind took it. No blame, no speculation, just a statement of fact. "Your animals?" she whispered, dreading the answer. He looked away for a moment towards the gray light outside. "Sorry, ma'am, barn went up almost as quick as the house. Bess." Sweet, gentle Bess, who had nuzzled her hand for a treat each morning. The chickens, clucking their silly, important pronouncements. More loss. It piled up, layer upon layer, until she felt she would suffocate beneath its weight. He cleared his throat. "There's water in the ewer. I left some clean clothes on the chair." Not much, but McTavish's wife left a few things. Might fit. He seemed uncomfortable, eager to be gone. Actions, not words, were clearly his domain. I don't know how to thank you," Elara said, looking down at the cup in her hands, the steam curling like a restless ghost. "You saved my life," he shrugged, a gesture that dismissed any notion of heroism. Anyone would have, but not everyone would have, she knew. Not everyone would have ridden into that inferno. He lingered for a moment as if unsure what else to say, or perhaps what was expected of him. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Elara sat on the edge of the cot, the coffee untouched. The silence of the small shack pressed in on her, amplifying the turmoil in her heart. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had painstakingly carved out of this harsh land. Their laughter, their struggles, their quiet moments of contentment, all reduced to a pile of smoking rubble. The clothes on the chair were simple, a faded calico dress and some undergarments, probably belonging to Mrs. McTavish. They smelled faintly of soap and disuse. The act of washing her face and hands in the cool water, of changing out of her ruined nightgown, was a small anchor in the vast sea of her disorientation. It was a step, however small, away from the horror, towards what? She didn't know. Later, when the sun had climbed higher, painting the drab landscape with a pale, watery light, she ventured outside. The man, Silas he'd told her his name was, in a brief, almost reluctant exchange when he checked on her again, was mending a piece of tack near a small, makeshift corral that housed his horse. A rangy sorrel. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her presence. The air was cold, with a biting wind that whipped her borrowed dress around her legs and tugged at the loose strands of her hair. She walked a little way from the shack, her gaze drawn eastward, towards where her home had stood. Even from this distance, she could imagine the blackened scar on the land, the lingering smell of devastation. The town of Redemption was a day's ride away, a small cluster of buildings huddled against the immensity of the plains. She had few friends there, mostly acquaintances. Thomas had been her world. Now, the thought of facing the townsfolk, their pity, their inevitable questions, their whispers, filled her with a weary dread. What would they say? A widow, alone, her homestead destroyed. Some might offer sympathy, genuine or feigned. Others, she knew, would speculate. Fires didn't just happen. Had she been careless? Or worse? The loneliness was a palpable thing, an ache that settled deep in her bones. Silas continued his work, his movements economical and precise. He was a man of few words, his silence as vast as the plains surrounding them. Yet, his presence was not entirely unwelcome. He had been there, he had seen. He didn't ask questions she couldn't answer, didn't offer condolences that would only underscore her pain. He simply was. He had brought her water, food, shelter. He had started a small fire in the shack's rudimentary stove earlier, taking the worst of the chill from the air before retreating to his own solitary tasks outside. These small, unspoken kindnesses were more comforting than any effusive sympathy could have been. As the day wore on, a fragile routine established itself. Elara mostly stayed inside the shack, staring out the window, lost in a fog of grief and shock. Silas came and went, tending to his horse, checking the McTavish's few head of cattle that grazed nearby. He brought her a bowl of thin stew in the evening, again placing it by the door with a quiet murmur. The bread from the morning was gone, and she realized with a pang of guilt that she hadn't even acknowledged its disappearance. He had likely assumed she'd eaten it. The act of eating felt like a betrayal, a concession to a life she wasn't sure she wanted to continue, but she forced herself to take a few spoonfuls of the stew. It was bland, but warm, and it settled some of the hollowness inside her. She thought about the future, a terrifying, blank canvas. She had nothing. No home, no money to speak of, her few belongings turned to cinders. The small plot of land was hers, deeded in her and Thomas's names, but what good was land without a roof, without the means to work it? The thought of returning to that charred patch of earth was unbearable, yet where else could she go? She had no family left to turn to. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Silas approached the shack again. McTavish's will be back day after tomorrow, most like, he said, his voice low, not quite meeting her eyes. Town ain't far. I can take you in tomorrow if you've a mind to go. Redemption. The name seemed a cruel irony. What redemption could she find there? Only pity and judgment. But what was the alternative? To stay here, a burden on this silent stranger and the absent McTavishes? The silence stretched between them, filled only by the mournful sigh of the wind. Elara looked at Silas, really looked at him. There was a loneliness in his eyes that mirrored her own, a weariness that spoke of a hard life. He was an enigma, a man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her, and who now seemed prepared to just as quietly disappear once he had delivered her to some semblance of safety. The unspoken gratitude she felt was immense, yet the words to express it felt inadequate, clumsy. The future was a terrifying unknown, and the path ahead was shrouded in the smoke of her recent past. But for now, the immediate question hung in the air: the town or something else? And what of the fire itself? His words, "Wind took it," echoed in her mind, but a small, cold seed of unease began to sprout. Had it truly been that simple? Or was there more to the night's horror than a rogue spark and a gust of wind? The subtle tension of her dependence on this stranger, coupled with the dawning questions about the true nature of her catastrophe, left her on a precipice, the cold dawn giving way to an even colder, more uncertain twilight. The journey to the site of her former home was a silent pilgrimage, undertaken the next morning under a sky the color of dull pewter. Silas had simply saddled his sorrel and another horse, a placid mare from the McTavish string, wordlessly offering Elara the chance to return, to see for herself what remained. She had accepted with a numb nod, a grim necessity pulling her towards the devastation. As they rode, the silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the plod of hooves on the hard-packed earth and the sigh of the wind through the prairie grass, a sound that now seemed to whisper of loss and desolation. Elara kept her gaze fixed ahead, bracing herself. When they finally crested the small rise that overlooked her valley, the sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs despite her mental preparation. It was worse than she had imagined, a scene of utter, bleak ruin. Where her small, tidy cabin had stood, a testament to love and hard work, there was now only a jagged, blackened foundation, a scattering of charred timbers, and a twisted, skeletal chimney pointing a mournful finger at the indifferent sky. The barn was a flattened heap of smoldering debris. The scent of ash and lingering smoke was heavy, a suffocating pall that clung to the air. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she swayed in the saddle. Silas reached out a hand, his fingers briefly closing over her arm, a steadying, impersonal touch, before he withdrew it just as quickly. He said nothing, his expression unreadable, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a practiced, almost detached assessment that she found strangely anchoring. He understood ruin, she sensed. It was perhaps a familiar landscape to him. They dismounted, the silence profound, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant hawk. Elara walked slowly towards the remnants of her life, each step an effort. The ground was littered with the detritus of the fire, blackened, unidentifiable objects, shards of pottery, the melted, contorted remains of what had once been cherished possessions. It was a graveyard of memories. She knelt by what had been the front stoop, where she and Thomas had sat on countless evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky. Her fingers brushed against a piece of scorched wood, and a sob, dry and tearing, escaped her. Silas did not intrude on her grief. He began a slow, methodical walk around the perimeter of the devastation, his eyes scanning the ground, not like a man looking for salvage, but more like one reading a grim story written in ash and soot. Elara watched him for a moment, his solitary figure moving against the backdrop of ruin. He was a man accustomed to observing, to noticing the small details others might miss. After a while, she too began to move, sifting aimlessly through the debris, though she knew not what she hoped to find. Everything of value, everything that had held meaning, was surely gone. Yet, the human heart clings to hope, even in the face of utter desolation. It was near the remains of the small bedroom window, the one she had escaped through, that she saw it, a glint of metal amidst the blackened earth. With trembling fingers, she reached down and picked it up. It was a small silver locket, a gift from Thomas on their first anniversary. It was tarnished, smoke-blackened, the delicate chain broken, but it was intact. The clasp, when she managed to pry it open with a fingernail, revealed two tiny, faded likenesses, herself and Thomas, their faces young, hopeful, untouched by the hardships that were to come. And certainly not by this final, fiery obliteration. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the tiny portraits. This small, resilient piece of her past, miraculously spared, felt like a tangible link to everything she had lost. She clutched it tightly in her palm, the cool metal a small point of reality in the overwhelming nightmare. Silas had made his way back to her side, his shadow falling over her. He looked down at the locket in her hand, then met her gaze. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something akin to sympathy in his stoic eyes, a fleeting softness that was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Sometimes," he said, his voice unusually gentle, "things hold on." It wasn't much, but it was more than she had expected. It was an acknowledgement of her pain, a shared understanding of the tenacity of memory, of love. They spent hours at the site, a silent, grim inventory of loss. Silas, with a surprising meticulousness, helped her sift through specific areas, his practical knowledge guiding their search. He found a cast-iron skillet, blackened but usable, and a few of Thomas's tools, their wooden handles burned away but the metal head still sound. Each salvaged item was a small bittersweet victory. As they worked, a fragile, unspoken connection began to form between them. It wasn't born of words, for they spoke little, but of shared experience, of the quiet companionship of two souls navigating a landscape of sorrow. Elara found herself speaking of Thomas, small memories bubbling to the surface, his kindness, his quiet strength, the way he used to hum off-key when he was mending fences. Silas listened, his attention unwavering, offering no judgment, only a quiet presence that made it easier to voice the grief that had been locked inside her. He, in turn, remained a closed book, his own past shrouded in the same silence he generally maintained. Yet, Elara began to sense the outlines of a man who had known his own share of hardship, who understood the language of loss perhaps better than he understood the easy camaraderie of towns and settlements. The town of Redemption, when they finally rode into it late that afternoon, felt alien and jarring after the desolation of the homestead and the quiet solitude of the McTavish line shack. Faces turned as they rode down the dusty main street, whispers following them like flies. Elara felt exposed, vulnerable, the invisible brand of tragedy stark upon her. Silas, seemingly oblivious to the stairs, reined in before the small building that served as the marshal's office and general store. Marshal Thompson, a portly man with a kind, weary face, emerged, his expression immediately sobering as he took in Elara's disheveled appearance and the grim set of Silas's jaw. The story was told briefly, factually, by Silas, Elara adding a few halting details. Sympathy was offered, genuine and heartfelt from the marshal, but Elara could also feel the undercurrent of curiosity, of speculation, from the few onlookers who had gathered. MrsBlank.com. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman known more for her sharp tongue than her charity, clucked her tongue with a show of pity that felt laced with a certain grim satisfaction. A terrible thing, Elara dear, terrible. One must be so careful with lamps and stoves, mustn't one? The insinuation, however veiled, was clear. Elara's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, clutching the salvaged locket in her hand. "It was an accident, Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Silas, who had been standing silently beside her, shifted his weight, his gaze briefly resting on Mrs. Henderson with an intensity that made the woman visibly falter. He said nothing, but his disapproval was a palpable force. Arrangements were made for Elara to stay temporarily in a small room above the general store, a charitable offer from the marshal that Elara accepted with a gratitude that was tinged with the humiliation of her dependency. As Silas prepared to leave, to return to the McTavish place, or perhaps to drift on to wherever the trail might lead him, Elara felt a sudden, unexpected pang of, not quite panic, but a deep reluctance to see him go. He had been her anchor, her silent protector in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. "Mr. Silas," she began, then hesitated, unsure what to say. "Thank you for everything." He met her gaze, his own steady. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a slight dip of his head. He turned to his horse, and for a moment, Elara thought he would simply ride away, disappearing from her life as abruptly as he had entered it. But then he paused, looking back not at her, but towards the direction of her ruined homestead. He said, his voice low, "A fire clears the way for new growth sometimes," and with that enigmatic pronouncement, he swung into the saddle and rode out of Redemption. Leaving Elara standing alone on the dusty boardwalk, the whispers of the town already beginning to swirl around her like the ashes of her former life. His words, however, lingered in her mind, a tiny, unexpected ember of something that might, just might, be hope. But the path from ashes to new growth felt impossibly long and arduous, and the eyes of redemption were upon her, judging, waiting. The small locket in her hand felt both a comfort and a burden, a reminder of a past that was gone, and a future she was too terrified to contemplate. The subtle tension now was not just her grief, but the dawning realization of societal judgment and the faint, almost imperceptible spark of resilience his parting words had ignited within her. The days that followed were a blur of weary formalities and the suffocating weight of public sympathy, much of it laced with an intrusive curiosity that Elara found almost unbearable. The room above Henderson's general store was small and airless, a constant reminder of her charity case status. Whispers followed her like her own shadow whenever she ventured out, whispers about the fire, about her future, about the mysterious cowboy who had rescued her, and then vanished as silently as he had appeared. Mrs. Henderson, with her knowing glances and thinly veiled questions, was a particular trial. "Such a tragedy, dear Elara," she'd say, her voice oozing a false sweetness. "And all alone now, a woman needs a protector, especially in these harsh lands. That cowboy, a strong sort, wasn't he? Though drifters, one can never be too sure." The implication hung heavy in the air, that Silas might have been an opportunist, or worse, somehow connected to the misfortune. Elara's quiet dignity was her only shield. She spent her time trying to piece together some semblance of a plan, but her thoughts were like scattered embers, easily dispersed by the winds of grief and uncertainty. The insurance money from the town's small benevolent fund was meager, barely enough to sustain her for a few weeks, let alone rebuild. The idea of leaving Redemption, of seeking a new life elsewhere, was terrifying. This land, despite its harshness, despite the tragedy it had dealt her, was the only home she had known since marrying Thomas. One afternoon, driven by a restless despair and a need to escape the suffocating confines of the town, Elara found herself walking the long, dusty road back towards her land. She didn't know why. There was nothing there for her but ruin and painful memories. Yet, an invisible cord pulled her onwards. As she neared the crest of the rise, she saw a lone figure working amidst the blackened debris. Her heart gave a strange, unexpected leap. It was Silas. He was clearing the charred timbers, piling them neatly to one side, his movements steady and purposeful. He hadn't vanished after all. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable as ever. But he didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and gestured towards the cleared patch of ground. "Good soil underneath?" he said by way of greeting. "Foundation's mostly sound." Elara stared, speechless for a moment. What are you doing?" she finally managed. He shrugged, picking up a blackened beam and adding it to the pile. "Seemed ashamed to let it sit. Land like this deserves a house. But I have no money to rebuild, no means," she said, the words a stark admission of her hopelessness. Silas continued his work, his silence more eloquent than any argument. He was not asking for permission, nor was he offering charity in a way that demeaned her. He was simply doing what he saw needed to be done, a man of action in a world that often seemed paralyzed by words and indecision. Over the next few days, a new, unspoken rhythm established itself. Elara would walk out to the homestead each morning, bringing what little food she could spare from the Hendersons' grudging provisions, usually bread and a piece of cheese. Silas, who seemed to subsist on air and sheer willpower, would already be there, toiling under the prairie sun. He had salvaged more tools from the wreckage, and with a quiet determination, he began the arduous task of clearing the site completely, preparing it for something new. He spoke little of his reasons, only remarking once when she pressed him that a man needs work and this is work that needs doing. Elara, at first a hesitant observer, soon found herself drawn into the labor. She started by clearing smaller debris, her hands, soft from disuse, quickly becoming blistered and sore. But the physical exertion was a balm to her wounded spirit, a way to channel her grief into something tangible, something that felt like progress, however small. They worked side by side, often in comfortable silence, the shared purpose forging a bond that was stronger than any words. Slowly, painstakingly, the site began to transform. The ugly scar of the fire began to recede, replaced by the clean, dark earth. Silas, it turned out, was a skilled woodsman and carpenter. He knew how to assess the remaining foundation stones, how to plan for a new structure, how to make do with limited resources. He began felling timber from the small wooded creek bed on the far edge of Elara's property, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing through the valley, a sound of industry and, dare she think it, hope. The town, of course, buzzed with gossip. Elara, the grieving widow, and the silent, mysterious cowboy, alone together on her ruined land. Mrs. Action, R.U. Gable, a self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, and a woman whose pronouncements carried considerable weight among certain circles, made her disapproval known. She cornered Elara one day in the general store, her voice sharp with condemnation. "It is not seemly, Elara, for a woman in your position to be consorting with a man of no known reputation, out there on your own. People are talking. It reflects poorly on you and on the memory of your dear Thomas." Elara, who months ago might have shrunk from such a confrontation, found a new strength welling within her. Perhaps it was the hard labor, the feel of the sun on her skin, or the quiet, unwavering support of the man who worked tirelessly beside her. "Mr. Silas is helping me rebuild my life, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice clear and steady, meeting the older woman's censorious gaze without flinching. "He is an honorable man. And my life, and how I choose to live it, is my concern, not the town's." Mrs. Gable huffed, taken aback by Elara's quiet defiance, but Elara stood her ground. The encounter, though unpleasant, was also liberating. She had found her voice. As the days turned into weeks, the framework of a new, small cabin began to rise from the ashes of the old. It was a modest structure, smaller even than the first, built with salvaged materials where possible, and new timber hewn by Silas's own hands. He taught Elara how to notch logs, how to mix daub for the chinking, how to read the grain of wood. She learned quickly, her determination fueled by a growing sense of purpose. There were moments of quiet connection, small islands of peace in their shared labor. Sharing a meager meal of roasted rabbit, Silas was a proficient hunter, by a small campfire as dusk settled, the silence comfortable, broken only by the chirp of crickets. A rare, fleeting smile from Silas when Elara managed to perfectly set a log. A moment when their hands brushed as they both reached for the same tool, a spark of awareness that was quickly suppressed, yet lingered in the air. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas spoke, his voice softer than usual. Had a place once, back east. Wife, a little girl. He stared into the flames, his face etched with a profound sorrow. Fever took him, same year. Elara's heart ached for him. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm for a moment. I'm so sorry, Silas. He nodded, acknowledging her words, but then the familiar reserve settled back over him. Yet, the brief confidence, the glimpse into his own past sorrow, had forged another link in the chain that bound them. He understood loss not just as an observer of her tragedy, but as a fellow traveler on that desolate road. The cabin was nearing completion. The roof was on, a sturdy testament to their combined efforts. Walls stood firm, windows were framed, awaiting the glass panes the marshal had promised to procure. It was a home again, or the promise of one. It was a symbol of resilience, of hope rising from despair, built not just of wood and mud, but of shared grief, quiet understanding, and an unspoken, burgeoning affection. Yet, the shadow of societal judgment still loomed. The town watched, waited, and Elara knew that the completion of the cabin would bring a new set of questions, a new set of decisions. The physical walls were rising, but the invisible barriers of propriety, of her widowhood, of Silas's transient nature remained. The subtle cliffhanger was no longer just about survival, but about the nature of their future, a future they were building with their own hands, yet one that society might still try to tear down. The almost finished cabin stood as a beacon, but also a challenge. The day the last pane of glass was fitted into the window of the new cabin, a crisp autumn wind was rustling the dry leaves in the creek bed, carrying with it the scent of distant wood smoke and the promise of winter. The small structure stood complete, a testament to weeks of relentless labor, a defiant assertion of life in the face of utter devastation. It was modest, even stark, yet to Elara, it was a palace, built not just with Silas's skill and her own determined effort, but with an unspoken understanding that had deepened with each log set in place, each nail driven home. They stood before it side by side, the silence between them no longer one of shared grief, but of shared accomplishment, tinged with an unspoken question that hung heavy in the cool air. What now? The physical act of rebuilding was largely over. The emotional rebuilding, however, was entering a new, more complicated phase. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of stew inside the cabin for the first time, the small stove radiating a welcome warmth, the atmosphere was different. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on the newly planed wooden walls, creating an illusion of intimacy that was both comforting and unsettling. Silas, usually so reserved, seemed quieter than ever, his gaze often drifting to the fire in the stove, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Elara, too, felt a strange mixture of triumph and trepidation. The cabin was a home, but for whom? For her, alone, or for them? The thought, unbidden, sent a flush of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the stove. The town of redemption had not been idle. Mrs. Gable, thwarted by Elara's quiet defiance, had redoubled her efforts, her whispers growing louder, more pointed. It's a scandal, she declared to anyone who would listen in Henderson's store. A widow, barely a season past her husband's memory, shacking up with a drifter. What kind of example is that? He'll take what he can get and be gone by spring, mark my words, leaving her ruined twice over. Some, Elara knew, listened and nodded, their own fears or prejudices confirming Mrs. Gable's pronouncements. Others, like Marshall Thompson and a few of the more independent-minded folk, kept their counsel, perhaps admiring Elara's resilience or Silas's quiet industry, but even they could not entirely shield her from the town's judgment. The climax, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation with an external villain, but a quiet, internal reckoning, precipitated by an unexpected visit. It was Reverend Davies, the town's earnest, slightly overwhelmed young preacher, who rode out to the homestead a few days after the cabin's completion. He found Elara and Silas splitting the last of the firewood, working in their now familiar, synchronized rhythm. The Reverend looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting between Elara, Silas, and the new cabin. After exchanging pleasantries, he cleared his throat. Mrs. Elara, he began, his tone earnest and concerned. And Mr. Silas, I've come as a friend, and as your spiritual guide, Elara, the town, there is talk about your arrangement here. Elara felt her spine stiffen. Silas stopped his work, his axe resting on the chopping block, his expression impassive, but his eyes, when they met hers briefly, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher: resignation, perhaps, or a weary understanding. "Reverend," Elara said, her voice calm, though her heart was pounding, "Mr. Silas has been a godsend. He helped me rebuild when no one else offered more than words. There is nothing improper in our arrangement." "I do not doubt his kindness, nor your strength, Elara," the Reverend said hastily. "But appearances, they matter in a small community. People are concerned for your reputation, for your well-being. As a widow, there are expectations. And Mr. Silas, being a man of no fixed abode," the unspoken accusation hung in the air. Silas finally spoke, his voice low and even. "Reverend, I've done nothing here but help a woman in need. If my presence causes Mrs. Elara distress or disrepute, I can be gone by morning." His words, matter of fact yet laced with a hint of weariness, struck Elara to the core. Gone? The thought of facing this new life, this new home, without his quiet strength, his steady presence, was suddenly unbearable. It was in that moment, faced with the stark possibility of his departure, that the true depth of her feelings for him crystallized. It wasn't just gratitude or companionship. It was something more profound, something that had taken root in the ashes of her old life and blossomed into a tender, resilient shoot of love. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him, at the lines of hardship and sorrow etched on his face, but also at the kindness in his eyes, the unwavering integrity that defined him more than his lack of a fixed address ever could. She saw not a drifter, but a man of quiet courage, a man who valued actions over words, a man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen, truly supported. Turning back to the Reverend, Elara took a deep breath. This was her confrontation, her significant decision. "Reverend Davies," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm, "I understand your concerns and the town's, but my well-being, my reputation, they are mine to define. Thomas was a good man, and I loved him dearly. His memory will always be a part of me, but my life did not end when his did. Mr. Silas, he has shown me that there can be new beginnings, even after great loss." She paused, then looked directly at Silas, her heart in her eyes. "He has helped me rebuild more than just a cabin. He has helped me rebuild my hope. And if the town cannot understand that, then it is their failing, not mine. As for his presence here," she hesitated, the next words the most difficult, the most vulnerable. "If he chooses to stay, it is because he is welcome." More than welcome. The silence that followed was profound. The Reverend looked taken aback, clearly not expecting such a forthright declaration. Silas stared at Elara, his usual stoicism momentarily shattered by an expression of raw, unguarded emotion, surprise, hope, and something akin to fear. He had lived a life of solitude for so long, a life defined by loss and transience. The idea of staying, of belonging, was perhaps as daunting to him as it was desired. Finally, he spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "Elara," he took a step towards her, his gaze searching hers. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Silas," she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, a tear not of sorrow, but of a new, burgeoning joy. He reached out, his calloused hand gently wiping the tear away, his touch sending a shiver through her. In that simple gesture, a world of unspoken emotion was conveyed. The Reverend Davies, witnessing this profound, quiet exchange, seemed to understand. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well," he said softly, "it seems God works in mysterious ways indeed. Perhaps I misjudged the situation." He looked from Elara to Silas, a new respect in his eyes. "Mrs. Elara, Mr. Silas, may you find happiness here, and if the town gossips, well, let them. True strength and true affection have a way of silencing even the most persistent whispers." He bid them goodbye, a weight seemingly lifted from his own shoulders, leaving Elara and Silas standing in the golden afternoon light, the unspoken now spoken, the decision made. The climax had been reached not with a shout, but with a whisper of truth, a brave declaration of the heart. Silas turned to Elara, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, now holding the warmth of a summer dawn. he said, a slow, rare smile transforming his weathered face. "This cabin needs a woman's touch to make it a proper home. And maybe this drifter has found a place to finally put down his roots, if you'll have him." "Oh, Silas," she breathed, her own smile radiant. "I think this drifter and this widow might just have found their way home, together." They stood there, not touching, but bound by an invisible thread of shared experience, newfound love, and the courageous choice to build a future together in the very place where everything had once been lost. The subtle cliffhanger was now one of joyful anticipation. Their life together was just beginning, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of the human heart to find love in the most unexpected of places, even amidst the ashes. The seasons turned, each one etching itself onto the landscape and into the fabric of Elara and Silas's new life together. The harsh prairie winter descended, blanketing their small valley in snow, but inside the sturdy cabin, warmth radiated not just from the well-tended stove, but from the quiet contentment that had settled between them. The initial whispers from redemption had gradually faded, replaced by a grudging respect, and in some quarters, even admiration. Reverend Davies became a staunch, if quiet, supporter, his Sunday sermons often touching on themes of forgiveness, new beginnings, and the unexpected blessings found in acts of kindness, themes that many in the congregation subtly understood to be nods towards the couple out at the old Thomas place, now the Silas place, as some had begun to call it. Mrs. Gable still pursed her lips, but her pronouncements carried less weight now, muted by the undeniable evidence of Elara's happiness and Silas's unwavering dedication. He had proven to be more than just a drifter. He was a steady, hard-working man, a kind neighbor, though he kept mostly to himself and Elara, and, most importantly, a devoted partner to the widow he had rescued from the flames. Their life was simple, built on the rhythms of the land and the quiet strength of their bond. Silas farmed a small acreage with a skill born of long experience, his hands, which had once seemed only capable of rough work, proving gentle with the earth. Elara made their cabin a home, filling it with the scent of baking bread, the bright colors of rag rugs she wove, and the soft melodies she would hum, tunes Thomas had loved, now shared with Silas, who would listen with a quiet smile. They spoke often of Thomas, not with sorrow, but with a gentle reverence, his memory, a benign presence in their lives, a part of the foundation upon which their new happiness was built. Silas never tried to replace him, and Elara never expected him to. Their love was its own unique entity, forged in crisis, tempered by hardship, and strengthened by mutual respect and a deep, abiding affection. Scars remained, of course. Elara would sometimes wake in the night, the scent of phantom smoke in her nostrils, the roar of the fire a distant echo in her memory. But Silas would be there, his steady presence, a comfort, his hand reaching for hers in the darkness, a silent reassurance that she was safe, that they were safe, together. And Silas, though he spoke little of his own past grief, found a measure of peace he had thought lost to him forever. The solitude he had once embraced as a shield had been replaced by a companionship that nourished his soul. In Elara's love, in the home they had built, he found an anchor, a reason to stay, a place where his heart, long weathered and weary, could finally rest. They became a fixture in the small community, not through overt engagement, but through their quiet dignity and the undeniable success of their rebuilt life. When spring arrived, their small field was one of the first to show green shoots. When a neighboring family fell on hard times, it was Silas who anonymously left a sack of flour and some smoked meat on their doorstep. Elara, in turn, would share her preserved vegetables or a freshly baked pie with Mrs. Henderson, whose initial suspicion had slowly, grudgingly, given way to a grudging sort of respect, perhaps even a touch of envy at Elara's quiet fortitude. The locket, salvaged from the ashes, still lay on Elara's bedside table, a reminder not just of lost love, but of resilience, of the enduring strength of the human spirit. It was a symbol that life and love could rise again, even from the most devastating of ruins. Their story became a quiet legend in redemption, a testament to the power of hope and the unexpected ways love could manifest. The dramatic rescue, the brave rebuilding, the defiance of societal judgment, it was a narrative of courage, perseverance, and ultimate triumph. The ashes of Elara's past had indeed cleared the way for new growth. a richer, more profound existence than she could have imagined in the depths of her despair. She had not only found a new home, but a new sense of self, a strength she hadn't known she possessed, and a love that was as steadfast and resilient as the prairie land itself. Silas, the stoic cowboy, had found more than just a place to put down roots. He had found a reason to let his own heart heal, to open himself to joy again. Their love was a quiet fire, not a raging inferno like the one that had brought them together, but a steady, warming flame that promised to burn brightly for all their days. It was a love born in the ashes, nurtured by shared adversity and destined to flourish under the vast, watchful sky of the West. And as you reflect on Elara and Silas's journey, perhaps you see echoes of it in the world around you, or even within your own life. Have you ever witnessed such resilience in the face of overwhelming loss, that quiet courage that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how fierce the storm? Think about the times when despair seemed to lay its heavy hand upon your shoulder, when the future looked like a landscape of ash and ruin. Where did you find that first flicker of hope, that unexpected hand reaching out from the smoke to guide you towards a new dawn? We all face our own fires, our own moments of devastation where it feels like everything we hold dear is being consumed. But Elara's story and Silas's reminds us that even in the deepest sorrow, the seeds of new beginnings can be found. It reminds us that human connection, the courage to be vulnerable, and the willingness to rebuild, piece by piece, can lead to a strength and a peace we never thought possible. What does it truly mean to be seen? Not for our past tragedies or our societal labels, but for the quiet courage and enduring spirit within us. Silas saw Elara, not just a grieving widow, but a woman of immense inner strength, and Elara saw Silas, not just a drifter, but a man of profound kindness and integrity. Their ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize the true worth in each other, was the foundation of their redemption. Consider the judgments you might face, or even the judgments you might cast upon others. How often do we allow societal expectations or superficial appearances to blind us to the deeper truths of a person's character or situation? Elara and Silas chose to defy those judgments, to build their life on their own terms, guided by their hearts. Their story is an invitation to look closer, to listen deeper, and to find the courage to support those who are bravely rebuilding their lives, often in the face of misunderstanding or prejudice. The path from ashes to new growth is rarely easy, but it is always possible. It requires perseverance, it demands hope, and it is made infinitely more bearable when walked with someone who believes in you, someone who helps you clear away the debris of the past to make space for a brighter future. So, what are your thoughts on Elara and Silas's journey to find love amidst the ruins? What moments resonated with you the most? We encourage you to share your reflections in the comments below. If this story of resilience, hope, and unexpected love touched your heart, please consider giving it a like, subscribing for more inspirational narratives, and sharing it with others who might find solace or strength in its message. For in every ending, there's the potential for a new beginning, and in every pile of ashes, the promise of a love that can rise, strong and true,